The air inside the cramped wagon is thick with the scent of iron and sweat, a holy, terrible perfume of life and death. Alara's hands, slick and steady, guide the child into the world as a storm rages outside, the canvas roof shuddering with each clap of thunder. The mother on the rough pallet beneath her, a stranger named Mary, gives a final, ragged cry that is half sob, half exultation. It is a boy, a perfect, screaming, red-faced boy. But the victory is fleeting. The mother's eyes, which have been bright with a desperate fire, begin to glaze over. Her breathing turns shallow, a faint whisper against the storm's fury. Beside her, the husband, the man whose name Alara still does not know, lies in a fever-soaked delirium, his arm bandaged with a strip torn from her own petticoat. He mutters names and places she cannot understand, lost in a world of pain while his own world is breaking apart right beside him. Alara, her own belly swollen and tight with the life she carries, wraps the newborn in a clean piece of linen, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She is alone, trapped in this stranger's tragedy, with a new life in her hands and another fading before her eyes. The man's delirious groan seems to ask a question she cannot answer. She knows only this. In the heart of a desolate wilderness, she has just delivered a stranger's baby, and now she is watching his wife die. Before we see how this small, desperate group can possibly survive the wilderness, tell us, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. She has no choice. There's a life here that needs her, a tiny, helpless creature caught between a dead mother and a father lost to fever. And so, as Mary's last breath rattles in her chest and the storm outside finally begins to weep, Alara holds the baby close, offering the only comfort she can. She looks from the still form on the pallet to the feverish man beside it, then down at her own round belly. The wagon, once a symbol of hope and passage, has become a tomb and a nursery, all under one leaking canvas roof. Her own journey is over for now, replaced by a duty she never sought to a family she does not know. The silence that followed the storm was more profound than the thunder had been. It was a hollow, ringing quiet, broken only by the soft, snuffling breaths of the newborn and the shuddering gasps of the sick man. Mary was gone. Alara had done what she could, a grim and desperate act of dignity, covering the poor woman's body with a spare wool blanket, her hands moving with a mechanical slowness that belied the tremor in her soul. She had sat for a long time in the pre-dawn gray, the baby cradled against her chest, listening to the drip of water from the trees and the slow, agonizing return of the world to life. She was a widow herself, her own Tom taken by a logging accident just 4 months prior, leaving her with nothing but a half-finished cabin, a mountain of debt, and the child growing within her. She'd sold what little they had and was heading west toward the Oregon territories, hoping to find a distant cousin who might take her in. Her own wagon had splintered an axle 3 days ago, a catastrophic failure that had left her stranded. She had been walking for 2 days, rationing the last of her hardtack and dried apples, when she'd stumbled upon this scene. Another broken-down wagon, a man with a blood-soaked bandage on his arm slumped against a wheel, and the moans of a woman in labor coming from within. Now, the sun was rising, casting pale, watery light through the tear in the canvas. The man stirred. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fluttered open. They were lucid for the first time, clear of the fever's haze, and they fixed on her, on the bundle in her arms. "Mary," he rasped, his voice raw. Alara's own throat was tight and dry. She couldn't find the words. She could only shake her head, a small, sorrowful movement. His gaze shifted, sweeping over the interior of the wagon, landing on the still, blanket-covered form. A sound escaped him, a strangled, guttural noise of pure anguish. He tried to sit up, his body seizing with the effort and the pain in his arm. "Easy now," Alara said, her voice finally finding its footing, soft but firm. "You've had a bad fever. Your arm." He ignored her, his eyes locked on his wife's shrouded body. The truth dawned on him, not as a slow realization, but as a physical blow. He slumped back against the sacks of flour he was propped on, his face crumbling. He didn't weep loudly. It was a silent, terrible grief, his shoulders shaking, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Alara felt like an intruder, a witness to a sorrow so private it felt profane to observe. She looked down at the baby in her arms, who had begun to fuss. She needed to do something, anything. Using a small tin cup, she scooped some of the precious water from her canteen and held it to the man's lips. He didn't seem to notice at first. Then, with a shuddering breath, he drank, his eyes never leaving the blanket. "The baby," he finally whispered, his voice broken. He's a boy," Alara said softly. "He's strong." She hesitated, then made a decision. Carefully, she shifted her position, her own pregnant form making the movement awkward, and placed the swaddled infant into the crook of his good arm. The man flinched, as if the child's weight was a shock. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, at the tuft of dark hair, and his expression of raw grief softened into something more complex, something akin to awe and terror. A tear, the first he'd shed, traced a path through the grime on his cheek and fell onto the baby's blanket. "Mary," he said again, this time a whisper of farewell. They existed in that suspended moment for what felt like an eternity. The world outside, with its birdsong and rustling leaves, seemed impossibly distant. Here, in the confines of the wagon, was the entire spectrum of human existence, a new life, a recent death, and two lost souls bound by the tragedy. "My name is Alara," she said into the quiet. "I was passing by." He looked up at her, his gaze taking in her swollen belly for the first time with any real comprehension. "Silas," he said, his voice hoarse. "Silas Croft." There was nothing more to say. The facts were laid bare between them, stark and brutal. He was a widower with a newborn son and an infected gunshot wound. She was a pregnant widow, stranded and alone. They were anchored to this spot by a broken wagon wheel and a fresh grave that needed digging. Later that morning, Silas, moving with the stiff, pained grace of a man running on sheer will, found the shovel tied to the side of his wagon. Alara tended to the baby, cleaning him as best she could and rewrapping him in a strip of flannel from a shirt in Mary's trunk. She found a small tin of condensed milk and, after watering it down, managed to get the baby, whom Silas had numbly decided to call Daniel, to take a few drops from the tip of her finger. She watched Silas work. He dug the grave under a tall pine tree, its branches offering a semblance of shelter. Each shovelful of earth seemed to cost him, his face pale and beaded with sweat, but he never faltered. There was a grim determination in the set of his jaw, a focus that walled off his grief and allowed him to function. He was a man accustomed to hardship. She could see that. His hands were calloused, his build lean but powerful. The way he moved, even when injured, spoke of a deep, physical competence. When the grave was ready, he came back to the wagon, his face a mask of stone. "I need to," he began, but his voice failed him. "I'll watch Daniel," Alara said, understanding immediately. He wrapped his wife's body in their best quilt, a colorful piece of patchwork that seemed a cruel mockery in the gray woods. He carried her as if she weighed nothing at all. Alara turned away, giving him his privacy, and focused on the baby, rocking him gently and humming a tuneless lullaby, her own tears blurring her vision. She cried not just for Mary, a woman she never knew, but for Silas, for the tiny boy who would never know his mother, and for herself for the crushing weight of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache. When Silas returned, the stony mask was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion that seemed to bone deep. He collapsed onto the ground by the wagon wheel and stared at his hands, as if he didn't recognize them. "The wheel is shattered," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Axle's cracked, too. We're not going anywhere in this." Alara looked from his wagon to the place where hers had met its end, miles back. They were well and truly stuck. "What were you heading for?" she asked. "Redemption Creek. It's a settlement about 50 miles west." Maybe less. He glanced at her. You, Oregon. A cousin in the Willamette Valley. The words sounded foolish now. A pipe dream from another lifetime. 50 miles. On foot, it was a hard journey. For a man with a festering wound, a pregnant woman, and a newborn baby, it was nearly impossible. They had Silas's supplies: flour, beans, coffee, some salt pork. More than she had, but not enough to last indefinitely. And Daniel needed more than watered-down milk. "You need a doctor for that arm," she said, nodding toward the blood-stained bandage. "And the baby, he needs a wet nurse. Or goat's milk at the very least." Silas looked at his son, fussing again in Alara's arms, and a flicker of fierce, protective fire entered his eyes. It was the first sign of life she'd seen in him since he'd woken up. "I know," he said. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. "We can't stay here." He began to work, his movements slow but methodical. He salvaged what he could from his wagon and hers, which he hiked back to with a grim determination, refusing her offer to help. He returned hours later, weary but successful, carrying a few more of her personal belongings. He jury-rigged a travois from 2 long poles and a length of canvas, a crude sledge that could be pulled. He loaded it with their most essential supplies: food, water barrels, blankets, the small trunk of Mary's things, and a crate that seemed to contain tools and books. He created a small, sheltered nest in the middle of it for Daniel. "I'll pull," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You walk alongside. Tend to the boy." It was a pact made without discussion, an alliance born of the purest necessity. He needed her to care for his son. She needed his strength and his knowledge of the trail to survive. They were 2 strangers, bound by a shared catastrophe, embarking on an impossible journey. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows through the trees, they left the 2 broken wagons and the lonely grave behind them. Silas leaned into the harness he'd fashioned from leather straps, the travois scraping against the forest floor, and Alara walked beside him, her hand resting protectively on her own belly, the future a terrifying, unknown country ahead of them. The first few days were a blur of aching muscles and relentless forward motion. The wilderness was an unforgiving partner in their grief. The terrain was rough, a mix of dense forest and rocky inclines that tested Silas's strength to its absolute limit. He moved with a silent, dogged persistence, his face a constant mask of pain he refused to acknowledge. Alara worried about his arm. The wound was angry and red, and though she cleaned it twice a day with boiled water and the last of her carbolic soap, she knew it was getting worse. The fever lingered, sometimes receding, only to return with a vengeance in the evenings, leaving him shivering and slick with sweat. During those times, she took over completely. She would build the fire, prepare their meager meal, usually a thin stew of beans and salt pork, and tend to both Silas and Daniel. She would spoon broth into Silas's mouth when he was too weak to feed himself and change the dressing on his arm with gentle, practiced hands. He would watch her, his stormy eyes clouded with fever but holding a dawning awareness, a silent gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. Their conversations were sparse, functional things. "Need more water. The boy is hungry. We should make camp here." Grief was a third traveler with them, a heavy, silent presence that filled the spaces between their words. Alara found she knew Silas not through his stories, but through his actions. She knew he was a man of immense pride by the way he gritted his teeth and pulled the travois even when he was swaying on his feet. She knew he was tender-hearted by the way his calloused finger would ghost over his son's cheek while the baby slept. She learned he was practical, almost to a fault, never wasting emotion or a resource. One afternoon, a week into their journey, they were crossing a shallow, fast-moving creek when Silas's foot slipped on a moss-covered rock. He went down hard, the travois lurching dangerously. Alara cried out as the crude sledge tilted, threatening to spill its precious contents into the water. Without a thought, she lunged, her own cumbersome body moving with surprising speed. She threw her weight against the high side of the travois, her feet sinking into the muddy bank, and managed to stabilize it just as Daniel let out a startled wail. Silas scrambled up, his face ashen, water streaming from his clothes. He ignored his own fall, his own pain, and immediately went to the baby, checking him with a frantic urgency. Daniel was wet and scared, but unharmed. Silas scooped him up, holding him tight against his chest, murmuring soothing sounds. He looked over at Alara, who was still bracing the travois, her dress soaked to the knees, her breath coming in ragged pants. "Thank you," he said, and the two words were heavy with meaning. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the debt that was growing between them. "We're in this together," she replied, though the effort of holding the sledge was making her arms tremble. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he moved to help. That night, as they sat by the fire, the air was different. The silence was less about grief and more about a shared experience. Silas watched her as she mended a tear in one of Daniel's flannel wraps, her needle moving with a swift, practiced rhythm in the flickering firelight. "You're good with him," he said quietly. Alara didn't look up from her work. "My pa was a doctor back in Ohio. Not a fancy one, just a country doctor. I helped him. Saw a fair few babies come into the world." She paused, the needle stopping for a moment. "And a fair few people leave it." It was the most she had offered about her past. He absorbed the information without comment, filing it away. A doctor's daughter. It explained her calm competence in the face of his wife's death, her skill with his wound. "And your husband?" he asked, his voice gentle, venturing into the territory of her own sorrow for the first time. "Tom," she supplied the name. "He was a good man. Strong. Thought he could take on any tree in the forest." Her voice thickened. "The forest one." Silas looked into the fire, his own loss reflected in its dancing flames. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry about your Mary," she returned, and the symmetry of their grief hung between them, a sad and sturdy bridge. As the days turned into a second week, a fragile routine took hold. They learned to anticipate each other's needs. She would have a cup of hot coffee ready for him when he woke. He would make sure to gather extra wood to keep the fire going through the night, so she and the baby stayed warm. Daniel was their shared center, a constant, demanding focus that kept them from sinking into their private despair. Finding a nanny goat that had been separated from a herd was a godsend. Silas had managed to catch it, and its milk, warm and fresh, had put color back into Daniel's cheeks. The nearness of their bodies became a simple fact of survival. At night, they slept on opposite sides of the fire, but the small circle of warmth was an intimate space. Alara would wake to the sound of Silas's fever-addled muttering and would go to him, placing a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. He would wake to the sound of Daniel's cries and watch as she bared her breast, not to feed the baby, for her own milk had not yet come in, but simply to offer the comfort of skin against skin, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated maternal instinct that made Silas's throat ache. One evening, as a cold rain forced them to huddle under a rocky overhang, Silas's fever spiked dangerously. He was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, his words a nonsensical jumble. Alara knew she had to get his wet clothes off and get him warm, or the infection would win. With fumbling, numb fingers, she managed to peel his wet shirt away from his torso. His chest and shoulders were a road map of old scars, faded white lines from knives, puckered circles from old bullet wounds. This was not the body of a simple farmer or rancher. This was the body of a man who had lived a life of violence. The sight of it sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the rain. Who was this man she had tied her fate to? She ignored the fear, focusing on the task. She stripped him to his trousers and wrapped him in every dry blanket they owned, pressing him close to the fire. She sat beside him all night, holding Daniel, periodically forcing water between his lips. Sometime before dawn, his shivering stopped. He fell into a deep, natural sleep, the first she had seen him have. The fever had finally broken. When he woke, the sun was up, and he felt clear. The pain in his arm was a dull throb instead of a fiery agony. The world seemed sharp and real again. He saw Alara, asleep sitting up, her head resting against a saddlebag, Daniel cradled protectively in her lap. Her face, in repose, was softer, younger than he had realized. Exhaustion had carved faint lines around her eyes, but it couldn't hide the fundamental kindness in the curve of her mouth. He saw the pile of his wet clothes, the way she had tended to him. He remembered flashes of the night, her cool hand on his brow, her steady voice cutting through his delirium. She had saved his life. He had pulled the travois, provided the food, but she had been the one to keep death at bay for both him and his son. A profound sense of responsibility settled over him, deeper than the simple pact they had made. It was no longer just about survival. It was about her. He had brought her into his chaos, and now he owed her more than just a safe arrival in Redemption Creek. He owed her a debt that had no name. A few days later, they met their first sign of civilization, a pair of trappers heading east. They were rough, bearded men with shifty eyes who stared at Alara's belly and then at the baby in her arms with open, leering curiosity. "That's a strange-looking family you got there," the taller one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's feet. "Man's got a fresh baby, and the woman's still carrying one. You work fast, mister." Silas, who had been leaning wearily against a tree, straightened up. His face, already grim, hardened into something dangerous. The easygoing exhaustion fell away, replaced by a stillness that was far more menacing than any outburst. "My wife is tired," Silas said, his voice low and cold as a river stone. "And you're blocking our path." The trapper's smirk wavered. He hadn't expected the sick-looking man to have a spine of iron. He glanced at his partner, who shrugged, then back at Silas's eyes. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider his amusement. "No offense meant," he muttered, stepping aside. "Just making an observation." They moved past without another word, but Alara felt their eyes on her back. The encounter left a sour taste in her mouth. It was a preview of what awaited them in Redemption Creek. They were an anomaly, a scandal on 2 feet. A widower, a widow, a newborn, and an unborn child. The world would not be kind in its assumptions. She looked at Silas, who was already moving again, his shoulders set, his focus back on the trail. He hadn't just corrected the trapper. He had called her his wife. It might have been a simple lie for convenience, a way to shut down prying questions, but the word hung in the air between them, fraught with 100 unspoken implications. He had protected her. He had claimed her, however briefly, as his own. And in that moment, Alara realized with a jolt that the thought didn't frighten her. It felt safe. The outskirts of Redemption Creek did not look like a place of salvation. They looked like a town holding its breath, waiting for a blow to fall. The few outlying homesteads they passed were shuttered and quiet. One had been burned to the ground, its blackened timbers stark against the afternoon sky. When they finally crested the last hill and saw the town proper nestled in the valley below, it was a grim sight. It was a haphazard collection of unpainted wooden buildings lining a single, wide, muddy street. There were no children playing, no women gossiping over fences. A few hard-faced men loitered on the porch of the saloon, their eyes tracking Silas and Alara's slow, conspicuous approach. The whispers started before they had even reached the first building. Faces appeared in dusty windows, their expressions a mixture of pity and suspicion. Alara felt a blush of shame creep up her neck. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and kept her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, focusing on the rhythmic scrape of the travois. Silas seemed oblivious to the stairs, or perhaps he was simply too used to them. His gaze swept over the town, assessing, calculating. He wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the buildings, the alleyways, the rooftops. It was the look of a man sizing up a battlefield. Their first stop was the doctor's office. It was a small, tidy building next to the mercantile. The doctor, a harried-looking man named Elias Gable, took one look at Silas's arm and clucked his tongue. "You're lucky you still have it," he said grimly, leading them inside. "This has gone bad. Real bad." While Dr. Gable worked on Silas's arm, cleaning and stitching the now-lanced wound, his wife, a kind, plump woman named Martha, took one look at Daniel and Alara and herded them into the back room, which served as the Gables' living quarters. "You poor dear," she said, her voice full of genuine compassion. She took Daniel from Alara's arms, cooing at him. "And you on your feet in your condition. Seat. The simple kindness was almost Alara's undoing. After weeks of relentless hardship, the comfort of a solid chair and a sympathetic face made her want to weep. Martha Gable asked no probing questions. She saw their exhaustion and their need and simply responded to it. She heated goat's milk for Daniel and a cup of strong, sweet tea for Alara. "You'll stay with us," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "We have a spare room. It's small, but the bed is soft." When Silas emerged from the surgery, his arm tightly bandaged and in a sling, his face pale but resolute, Martha repeated the offer to him. He looked at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a slight, grateful nod. "We be obliged, ma'am," Silas said, his voice rough with fatigue. "We can pay." "Nonsense," Martha bustled. "It's the Christian thing to do." But as they settled in, the town's troubles began to seep through the Gables' kindness. Over a dinner of thick beef stew, Dr. Gable explained the situation. "It's the Blackwood gang," he said, his voice low. "3 brothers. Mean as cornered snakes. They rode in about 2 months back. The old sheriff, Miller, he stood up to them. They shot him down in the street, right in front of the saloon." Martha shuddered. "They've been bleeding the town dry ever since. Taking what they want. Protection money, they call it. There's no law to speak of. The deputy lit out the day after Miller was killed. We sent for a marshal, but who knows if the message even got through." Silas listened, his expression unreadable, his fork moving methodically. He asked a few questions. How many men? What kind of weapons? Were they holed up? That seemed strangely technical for a simple traveler. "They've taken over the old livery," Dr. Gable supplied. "It's like a fortress. No one dares go near it." The next day, Silas insisted on finding work. Despite the doctor's protests, he said he had to earn their keep. He found a day's labor helping the blacksmith, Jed, mend fences, working one-handed, his movements slow but steady. Alara spent the day with Martha, helping with chores, mending clothes, and caring for Daniel. It felt blessedly, achingly normal. But the town's judgment was a constant, low hum. When Alara walked with Martha to the mercantile, women would stop talking as they approached, their eyes lingering on her belly, then flicking to the Gable house where the strange man was staying. The story had already taken root. A desperate pregnant widow had shacked up with a grieving widower, all under the roof of the good doctor. It was a scandal, a morsel of gossip in a town starved for any distraction from its fear. One afternoon, Alara was sitting on the Gables' porch, rocking Daniel's cradle with her foot, when a woman strode up to the fence. She was tall and severe, dressed in unrelenting black. It was Mrs. Prynne, the preacher's wife, the self-appointed moral compass of Redemption Creek. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice dripping with false piety. "I see the child as well." "Yes, ma'am," Alara said quietly. "It is a tragedy what happened to his mother. A true tragedy," Mrs. Prynne's eyes narrowed. "And a strange providence that you should be found by Mr. Croft. Very strange indeed, living here under the same roof. It is not seemly." Alara's face burned. "Mrs. Gable has been very kind." "Kindness does not negate propriety," the woman sniffed. "A woman in your delicate state should be mindful of appearances. The whole town is talking." Before Alara could form a response, Silas rounded the corner of the house. He had a stack of freshly split firewood in his good arm. He stopped when he saw Mrs. Prynne, his gaze taking in the woman's judgmental stance and the flush on Alara's cheeks. He set the wood down with a soft thud. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Prynne?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it had an edge of steel that made the preacher's wife take an involuntary step back. "Sheriff Croft," she stammered, her eyes wide with shock. I didn't recognize you." Alara stared, confused. "Sheriff." Silas's face didn't change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "It's just Silas now," he said. "And this woman is under my protection. If you have something to say, you say it to me." Mrs. Prynne paled. No, no, of course not. I was just welcoming her to town. She gave a curt, flustered nod and beat a hasty retreat down the street. Alara looked at Silas, her mind reeling. Sheriff? What did she mean? Silas sighed, the hard edge leaving him as he looked at her. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of deep weariness. It was a long time ago. Different town, different life. He looked out at the street, at the saloon where the Blackwood gang held their court. A life I thought I'd left behind. The secret was out, not just to Alara, but to the town. Mrs. Prynne, in her haste to spread the new, more tantalizing gossip, had made sure of that. Silas Croft wasn't just a drifter. He was a former lawman. By nightfall, the whole of Redemption Creek knew. And with that knowledge, a dangerous seed of hope began to sprout in the terrified heart of the town. That evening, a delegation arrived at the doctor's house. It was the mayor, a portly, sweating man named Abernathy, Jed the blacksmith, and two other grim-faced members of the town council. They stood shuffling their feet on the porch, hats in their hands, until Silas came to the door. Croft, Mayor Abernathy began, clearing his throat. We heard who you are. What you were. Silas leaned against the doorframe, his sling a stark white against his dark shirt. He waited, saying nothing. The thing is, the mayor continued, emboldened by Silas's silence, we're in a bad way here. The Blackwoods, they're going to kill this town. We need a sheriff. We need a man who knows how to handle scum like them. He held out a tarnished silver star. We had a vote. The council is prepared to offer you the position and the full backing of the town. Silas stared at the star. It seemed to catch the lamplight, a small, heavy piece of metal that represented everything he had run from. He had left that life after a shootout had gotten an innocent bystander killed. The guilt had driven him to seek peace, to build a quiet life with Mary, a life that was now ashes. He wanted nothing more than to take his son and Alara and disappear into the wilderness again, to find some quiet corner of the world where trouble couldn't find them. But he looked past the mayor, down the dark street, toward the raucous noise of the saloon. He thought of the burned-out homestead. He thought of the fear in Dr. Gable's eyes. And he thought of Alara, inside the house, who had just begun to find a fragile sense of safety. The Blackwoods wouldn't let them be. Sooner or later, their brand of ugly would come knocking on this very door. His peace was a fiction as long as they were here. From the back room, Alara heard the murmur of voices. She held Daniel close, her heart pounding. She knew what they were asking him. She had seen the man who faced down the trappers, the man whose body was a testament to a violent past. She had also seen the man who grieved for his wife and held his son with a heartbreaking tenderness. She was terrified of the choice he had to make and terrified of what would happen, no matter which path he chose. Silas's gaze fell on the star again. He could run, or he could stand his ground, not just for the town, but for the new, fragile family he had inadvertently created. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. He slowly reached out his good hand and took the star from the mayor's trembling fingers. I'll need a deputy I can trust, he said, his voice resonating with an authority that had been dormant for years, and a dozen men who can shoot straight and follow orders. As the mayor's face broke into a relieved grin, a sharp, sudden pain shot through Alara's lower back. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Her baby was coming. The timing was a cruel jest of fate. Just as Silas had accepted a war, her own battle was beginning. Martha Gable, hearing her cry, rushed into the room, her face a mixture of alarm and calm resolve. It's time, dear, she said, taking Alara's arm. It's time. The news ripped through the small house with the force of a physical shockwave. As Martha and Dr. Gable helped a pale but determined Alara to the spare bedroom, Silas stood frozen in the parlor, the sheriff's star still clutched in his hand. The mayor and his men, their moment of triumph forgotten, mumbled their congratulations and quickly departed, leaving Silas alone with the two converging crises. He was caught between two worlds. In the front of the house, the world of men, of violence and duty, awaited him. He could hear the faint, boisterous laughter from the saloon down the street, the sound of the enemy he had just pledged to face. In the back of the house, The world of women, of life and pain, was unfolding. A low moan from the bedroom sliced through him, a sound that was both familiar and newly terrifying. It was Mary's voice, and it was Alara's all at once. He was paralyzed. He was the sheriff. He should be planning, gathering his men, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Blackwoods. But every instinct screamed at him to go to that back room, to stand guard outside the door, to do something, to not be useless while she faced her trial alone. Silas, Dr. Gable appeared at the parlor door, his sleeves rolled up. "She's asking for you." The request stunned him. He pushed himself away from the wall and walked, as if in a trance, to the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. He could see Martha wiping Alara's brow with a damp cloth. Alara's face was slick with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the iron bed frame. Her eyes found his through the opening. "You be careful," she gasped, the words punctuated by a sharp intake of breath. "Don't you be a hero, Silas Croft. You have a son that needs you." Her words were not for a sheriff. They were for him. A plea not for the town's safety, but for his. In the midst of her own agony, she was thinking of him, of Daniel. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, breaking through his paralysis and forging his resolve into something sharp and absolute. He wasn't just fighting for a principle or a town. He was fighting for her, for them, for this strange, broken, beautiful thing that had grown between them in the shadow of death and hardship. He gave her a single, sharp nod, a promise that needed no words. Then he turned and strode out of the house, the star now pinned to his shirt. The cool night air hit him, clearing his head. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but now it was fuel. He found Jed the blacksmith first. The big man was banking the fires in his forge, his face grim. "Heard you took the star," Jed said, not looking up. "I did," Silas replied. "The mayor said you could shoot straight." Jed finally looked at him, his eyes measuring. "I can. The Blackwoods are in the saloon. I'm going to talk to them. I need you and 3 other men on the rooftops opposite. One on the mercantile, one on the assay office. You cover the windows and the door. If they start shooting, you finish it. But not before my signal." "What's the signal?" "If I don't walk out in 10 minutes. Jed's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. He knew a man with a plan when he saw one. While Jed went to gather the men he trusted, Silas walked to the far end of town, to the darkened livery. He moved through the shadows with a fluid grace that belied his injured arm. He found what he was looking for, a forgotten side door, its lock rusted through. He slipped inside, the smell of hay and manure filling his nostrils. The Blackwoods horses were there, as he'd expected. With quiet, efficient movements, he loosened the cinches on their saddles, just enough to be unnoticeable, but enough to make a fast getaway impossible. It was a small thing, but small things won fights. Back on the main street, he saw Jed and the others slip into position on the rooftops, rifles glinting in the moonlight. The town was deathly quiet now. Every window was dark. The only island of light and sound was the Grand Saloon. From the Gables' house, another cry from Alara reached him, carried on the night air. It spurred him onward. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and stepped out of the shadows, walking down the middle of the muddy street toward the swinging doors of the saloon. His footsteps echoed in the silence. It felt like the longest walk of his life. He pushed through the doors. The saloon went instantly quiet. The tinny piano music stopped. About a dozen men were inside, but Silas only had eyes for the 3 at the back table. The Blackwood brothers. Caleb, the leader, was big and bearded, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The other 2, Eli and Jonah, were leaner, meaner versions of their brother. "Well, look what we have here," Caleb drawled, leaning back in his chair. "A one-armed man with a shiny new star. Town must be more desperate than I thought." Silas ignored the goad. He walked slowly toward their table, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. His gaze was steady, calm. "I'm a new sheriff. There are new rules. The first one is, you're leaving. Now." The saloon erupted in laughter. Caleb slammed his hand on the table, his good humor vanishing. "Is that so? And who's going to make us?" "You." "I am," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. And the men with rifles pointed at every window and door in this saloon. The laughter died. Eli and Jonah exchanged nervous glances, their hands inching toward their pistols. "You're bluffing," Caleb snarled, but the confidence had gone from his voice. "Am I?" Silas replied. "There are 4 of them, all good shots. They have orders to shoot anyone who isn't me that comes through that door, or any man that draws a weapon in here. You could try me, but you'll be dead before you clear leather. Your brothers too. Maybe you get lucky and take me with you, but you'll still be dead." He let the silence stretch, the tension in the room becoming a palpable thing. He could feel the eyes of his snipers on him, could feel the weight of Alara's fight down the street. "Get your things and ride out," Silas said, his voice flat and final. "The town's generosity is over." Caleb stared at him, his mind racing, weighing the odds. He looked at the windows, searching for a sign, but saw only darkness. The stranger's confidence was absolute. It was the confidence of a man who had been in this exact situation a dozen times before and had walked away every time. Then, the decision was made for him. A single, high-pitched cry echoed from down the street, the cry of a newborn baby. The sound, so out of place in the tense standoff, broke the spell. For a fraction of a second, Silas's composure flickered. His eyes darted toward the door, a wave of relief and fierce pride washing over him. It was the opening Caleb needed. Seeing the sheriff's momentary distraction, he lunged, not for his gun, but to overturn the heavy oak table, shoving it towards Silas as a shield. "Get him," he roared. The saloon exploded into chaos. Eli and Jonah drew their pistols, firing wildly, but Jed and his men were ready. Glass shattered as rifle shots punched through the windows. Eli went down with a cry, clutching his chest. Jonah dove for cover behind the bar, firing back. Silas, reacting on pure instinct, had thrown himself to the floor as the table came at him, his good hand already drawing his Colt. He fired from the ground, the shot aimed not at Caleb, but at the large mirror behind the bar. It exploded, raining shards of glass down on Jonah, distracting him for the crucial seconds Silas needed. He fired again, and Jonah slumped over the bar, silent. Caleb, shielded by the table, was trying to get a clear shot. Silas rolled, coming up on one knee behind an overturned card table, the world narrowing to the space between him and the last Blackwood brother. Gunshots filled the air, the smell of cordite thick and acrid. A bullet splintered the wood next to Silas's head. He stayed calm, breathing slowly, waiting for his moment. He heard Caleb reloading, the frantic clicking of his cylinder. It was now or never. Silas burst from behind his cover, firing twice. The first shot took Caleb in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second was true. Caleb Blackwood stared at Silas, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the floor. Silence descended, broken only by the tinkling of a single piece of falling glass and the ragged sound of Silas's own breathing. The other patrons were huddled under tables, unmoving. The fight was over. It had lasted less than a minute. Silas slowly got to his feet, his entire body trembling with adrenaline. He was alive. He holstered his pistol and, without a look at the bodies on the floor, turned and walked out of the saloon, back into the quiet, moonlit street. He didn't see the faces of the townsfolk peering out from their windows, or Jed climbing down from the roof, a look of awe on his face. He only saw the warm light spilling from the window of the doctor's house. He started to walk, then broke into a run, the pain in his arm forgotten, his heart pounding for an entirely different reason. He burst through the door, his clothes dusty and smelling of gunpowder. Martha Gable met him in the parlor, her face tired but beaming. "You have a daughter, Sheriff," she said softly. "A beautiful, healthy girl." He pushed past her gently, his eyes wild. He went to the bedroom and stopped in the doorway. Alara was propped up on pillows, looking pale and utterly exhausted, but her eyes were shining. In her arms was a tiny, swaddled bundle. Daniel was asleep in his cradle in the corner, undisturbed by the shootout that had decided his future. Alara looked up at him, her gaze taking in his disheveled state. She saw a smudge of gunpowder on his cheek, a new rip in his shirt. But he was whole. He was alive. A tear of pure relief traced a path down her cheek. "I told you not to be a hero," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. Silas walked to the bed and knelt beside it, his long frame folding awkwardly. He looked from Alara's tired, beautiful face to the new life she held. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the baby's soft cheek. A daughter. His mind couldn't quite grasp it. This tiny creature, born in the midst of violence, was a symbol of the life he had just fought for. He looked at Alara, and in her eyes, he saw not the stranger from the wagon, not the woman who had nursed him, but his partner, his home. The titles and tragedies that had defined them, widow, widower, sheriff, all fell away. In the quiet of the room, with the sound of two babies breathing softly, there were simply Silas and Alara. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply took her free hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. He held on tight, grounding himself in her touch. The town had a new sheriff, and he had a new life. It was a life forged in a stranger's wagon, tested on a brutal trail, and finally born in a town called Redemption. He looked at the family before him, his family, and knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he was finally home. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.